In the version of history most people know, a German artillery officer named Werner Pluskat stood inside a concrete bunker overlooking a stretch of Normandy coastline in the last dark hour before dawn on June the 6th, 1944, raised a pair of binoculars toward the English Channel, and became the first German officer to see the Allied invasion fleet. The story goes that he stared for a long moment at what looked like the entire horizon crawling toward him, thousands of ships stretching from one edge of his field of view to the other, called it in to his superiors, and was told, in effect, not to be ridiculous, that the Allies would never actually attempt a landing in that particular stretch of Normandy. That version of events, dramatized in a best-selling book and later a major Hollywood film, watched by millions of people over the following 6 decades, has been repeated in documentaries and history programs so many times that most retellings no longer bother citing where the story actually came from. There is a real possibility that a fair amount of it never actually happened the way Pluskat told it, decades after the fact, to a journalist writing a book that needed a gripping human anchor for its opening chapter. This is the story of the most famous eyewitness account of D-Day's opening hour. The man who told it, the fellow German soldier who spent decades afterward insisting it was largely fiction, and the actual, less cinematic morning that historians have had to reconstruct from what fragmentary evidence actually survives. Every week we take apart a moment when a war turned, the people who claim to have seen it happen, and the gap between the legend and the record. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. Werner Pluskat was born in 1912 and by June of 1944 held the rank of major, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, part of the German 352nd Infantry Division, stationed along a stretch of the Normandy coast that Allied planners had designated Omaha Beach, one of 5 landing zones chosen for the invasion months earlier by planners working from aerial photographs and intelligence reports the German defenders had no way of seeing. According to the account Pluskat gave after the war, and which journalist and author Cornelius Ryan later included in his 1959 book about D-Day, Pluskat had spent the night before the invasion at a chateau several miles behind his own gun batteries, brought his dog along around midnight to check on his forward observation post overlooking the coast, and found nothing unusual on the water through the small hours of the morning, despite the low, steady drone of aircraft passing somewhere overhead in the darkness. It was only in the last stretch before dawn, by his own telling, after fog and low visibility had kept the channel largely obscured for hours, that he raised his binoculars one final time before planning to head back to his own headquarters, and saw the invasion fleet emerging out of the mist, a sight he would go on to describe decades later in language dramatic enough that a Hollywood screenwriter barely needed to embellish it. Pluskat's account, retold by Ryan and later dramatized on screen in the 1962 film The Longest Day, became the single most widely repeated eyewitness description of the moment the Allied invasion was first discovered by the German defenders, largely because Pluskat himself served as a technical consultant on the film and gave interview after interview in the decades that followed, reinforcing the same basic story with remarkable consistency from one telling to the next. In a 1964 French television interview marking the invasion's 20th anniversary, Pluskat stated plainly that he had stood in that exact spot as the first German officer to witness the approaching Allied fleet, a claim delivered with the same quiet confidence Ryan's book had already given millions of readers around the world. For years, that claim went essentially unchallenged in the popular retelling of the invasion's opening hours, repeated in documentary after documentary and television special, as settled historical fact rather than as one man's personal, decades-old recollection of a single chaotic morning that thousands of other men had also lived through from dozens of different vantage points along the same coastline. The challenge to that story came from a German soldier who had actually spent June the 6th, 1944, exactly where Pluskat claimed to have been that morning, at the coastal strongpoint overlooking Omaha Beach itself, rather than hearing about it decades later through a book or a film production. Heinrich Severlo, a machine gunner stationed at a position the Germans designated Widerstandsnest 62, fired on American troops throughout the landing, and later became known, grimly, as the man who may have killed more Allied soldiers on D-Day than any other individual German defender that day, a distinction that would shape the rest of his own life far more directly than any dispute over who had first spotted an approaching fleet. Decades later, in his own published memoir describing his experience defending Omaha Beach, a book written specifically to set down his own version of a morning he had spent years watching other people's accounts define in his place, Severlo wrote directly that Pluskat had not actually been present with his unit on the morning of the invasion, and that the film's depiction of him was, in Severlo's own words, not a truthful portrayal of what had really happened at that position. Severlo was in a position almost nobody else who has commented publicly on Pluskat's story could claim, a man who had actually been at the exact location in question at the exact hour in question, watching the same beach Pluskat later described watching from the same bunker, close enough to know precisely who else had genuinely been standing beside him that particular morning. Modern historians who have tried to reconstruct the actual sequence of events from surviving German unit records, rather than from post-war interviews conducted years or decades after the fact, describe a morning considerably less cinematic than the legend, though not necessarily one that contradicts every detail of Pluskat's account outright, since some elements of his story do align with what independent records suggest. Low cloud cover and mist over the channel appear to have genuinely limited visibility for German coastal observers through much of the pre-dawn hours, with the fleet likely not becoming visually confirmable from shore positions until somewhere around 5 in the morning, once the fog had begun to lift enough for a distant lookout to make out shapes on the water rather than an undifferentiated gray horizon. Airborne activity, the distant drone of aircraft engines carrying paratroopers toward drop zones further inland, had already been noted by German units as early as around 1 in the morning, hours before any coastal observer could have visually confirmed a seaborne invasion fleet. But those early reports were treated by German commanders as isolated airborne activity or a diversionary raid, rather than the leading edge of the actual invasion, exactly the kind of dismissive first read that would go on to cost the German defense its most valuable resource that morning, time. Whoever first visually confirmed the fleet from the coast, whether it was Pluskat exactly as he described it, another officer entirely, or some combination of overlapping reports from multiple positions along the same stretch of coastline reaching headquarters within minutes of each other, that confirmation arrived into a German command structure already primed, for reasons that had nothing to do with any individual observer's competence or credibility, to dismiss it out of hand. That predisposition to disbelief had been carefully, deliberately manufactured months in advance by an entirely different operation on the other side of the channel, one that had nothing directly to do with Omaha Beach or with any individual German artillery officer's own alertness that particular morning. Allied deception planners, running what was known as Operation Fortitude, had spent more than a year feeding German intelligence a steady stream of fabricated evidence suggesting the real invasion, when it eventually came, would land far to the northeast at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest and most obvious crossing point of the channel, rather than at Normandy at all. That deception effort, built around a fictional American army group appearing to mass in southeast England, complete with dummy tanks, dummy landing craft, and staged radio traffic, and reinforced by a network of double agents feeding false but consistently detailed reports directly to German intelligence over a period of years, had worked precisely as intended by the time the real invasion finally arrived, so thoroughly that German commanders continued reinforcing the Pas de Calais sector for weeks after the Normandy landings had already begun, still half convinced the true blow was yet to fall. When reports of activity off the Normandy coast began reaching German headquarters in the small hours of June the 6th, they arrived into a command culture already convinced, based on more than a year of accumulated, carefully engineered evidence from sources German intelligence itself considered reliable, that Normandy was far more likely to be a diversion staged to draw reserves away from the true target than the main event itself. A junior officer's report of ships on the water, however accurately or inaccurately that specific report was later dramatized for a paying audience 2 decades afterward, was never going to receive the kind of immediate, unquestioning belief the moment actually demanded, because the German High Command had already spent a year training itself, quite deliberately by design on the Allied side, to expect the real attack somewhere else entirely. Separately from Pluskat, another German officer has his own documented claim to some version of the same distinction, a detail rarely mentioned in the popular retellings that have made Pluskat's name the one most closely associated with the moment. Oberleutnant Walter Ohmsen, commanding a coastal battery position known as the Krisbeck Battery, some distance from Pluskat's own sector along the coast, is also credited in some historical accounts with being among the first to detect the approaching invasion fleet, using his battery's own range-finding equipment rather than a pair of handheld binoculars from an isolated observation bunker. The existence of a competing, separately documented claim to essentially the same moment underscores just how difficult it is to assign a single, definitive first sighting to any one man along a coastline where multiple German observation posts were, by the early hours of the morning, independently beginning to notice the same enormous fleet approaching from different vantage points at roughly the same time, each one with no way of knowing what any of the others were simultaneously reporting up their own separate chains of command. Whatever the precise sequence of who saw what and when, the practical outcome for Pluskat's own men that morning was not in serious dispute among any of the competing accounts, and it is worth pausing on the scale of that outcome specifically, since the argument over who first spotted the fleet can otherwise distract from the far more consequential fact of what German defenses actually did to the men landing beneath them once the fighting started in earnest. His artillery batteries opened fire on the approaching and landing Allied forces at Omaha Beach and continued firing until they ran out of ammunition, part of the same layered German defense, bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery positions working in concert across overlapping fields of fire that had been carefully sited months in advance, specifically to cover every approach to the beach that made Omaha, by a wide margin, the costliest of the 5 invasion beaches for the Allied troops who came ashore there that morning, casualties running into the thousands within the first few hours alone, a toll steep enough that some American commanders reportedly considered, at points during that first morning, whether the landing at Omaha specifically might have to be abandoned entirely. As the American and Allied forces fought their way off the beach and inland over the following days and weeks, gradually overwhelming positions that had inflicted brutal losses in the invasion's opening hours, German positions along the coast were progressively overrun or forced into retreat, and Pluskat's own subsequent movements through the remainder of the Normandy campaign are considerably less documented in popular accounts than his single, famous morning at the observation bunker, a testament to how thoroughly that one scene came to eclipse everything else about his wartime service in the public imagination. Pluskat survived the war. Nearly a year after D-Day, on April the 23rd, 1945, he surrendered to soldiers of the United States 30th Infantry Division near Magdeburg, in the company of a German lieutenant general named Kurt Dittmar, as the war in Europe entered its final collapsing weeks and organized German resistance disintegrated across the country. After the war, Pluskat settled into a comparatively quiet life in Germany, and it was really only in the years following the publication of Ryan's book and the release of The Longest Day that his name became widely known outside a narrow circle of military historians who had already been aware of his unit's role at Omaha Beach, his own post-war interviews, and his consulting role on the film, cementing the version of the story that would go on to be repeated for the rest of his life, and long after his death, in documentaries whose researchers, more often than not, simply cited the film and the book rather than tracking down the underlying primary sources for themselves. He died in Heilbronn, Germany on June the 11th, 2002, at 90 years old, having spent the last 4 decades of his life as, in the eyes of the wider public, the man who first saw D-Day, a title Heinrich Severlo's own memoir had, by the time of Pluskat's death, already begun quietly to undermine within the smaller community of historians and veterans who took the dispute seriously enough to dig into the surviving unit records themselves, rather than simply repeating what the film had already made famous. Cornelius Ryan, the Irish-American journalist whose 1959 book The Longest Day first brought Pluskat's account to a mass audience, had built his research on hundreds of interviews with veterans from both sides of the invasion, a genuinely ambitious undertaking for its era that produced one of the most widely read popular histories of the entire war. But Ryan, like most journalists working against a publishing deadline rather than the slower, more skeptical pace of academic historical review, had limited practical ability to cross-reference every individual veteran's personal recollection against surviving unit records from a war that had ended barely 14 years earlier, records that in many cases were still classified, scattered across multiple national archives, or simply not yet cataloged in any form a working journalist could reasonably access. A dramatic, well-told personal account from a cooperative, articulate interview subject like Pluskat, willing to describe the invasion's opening moments in vivid, cinematic detail, was, from a narrative standpoint, exactly the kind of material a book built to sell to a general readership needed at its opening. Whether that same account would have survived close scrutiny against the testimony of every other man stationed along the same stretch of coast that morning was, for the book's purposes, a considerably less pressing question than whether the story actually worked on the page. Heinrich Severlo himself lived considerably longer with the weight of his own documented actions that morning, having fired, by his own later estimate, thousands of rounds into the advancing American troops on Omaha Beach from his position at Widerstands Nest 62, before finally being forced to withdraw as his position was overrun late in the fighting. Severlo's own post-war life was shaped far more by guilt and public scrutiny over the sheer number of casualties his own individual position was credited with inflicting than by any dispute over who had first spotted the invasion fleet, a burden he reportedly carried privately for decades before finally choosing to speak and write about his own experience in detail. His memoir's specific challenge to Pluskat's story reads, in context, less like a bid for his own share of the spotlight than like the frustrated correction of a man who had actually lived through the morning in question, watching someone else's account of it become the accepted historical record instead, repeated in film and television and popular history books that never once thought to track down the machine gunner who had actually been dug in at the position Pluskat's story ran straight through. This is not a story about which German officer deserves the specific credit for spotting an invasion fleet that, by the time any single observer confirmed it, was already approaching a 50-mile stretch of coastline defended by thousands of men in dozens of separate positions, several of whom likely glimpsed some part of it at broadly similar times without any of them necessarily being first. In any meaningful, verifiable sense, the historical record can actually settle. It is a story about how a single, vivid, well-told account, delivered by a charismatic survivor with a direct line to a best-selling author and a Hollywood film production, can outcompete a far messier, more contested reality simply by being more useful to the people telling the larger story of that morning, a compelling narrator's version of events settling into the popular record decades before anyone with equal or better claim to the truth had the platform, or in some cases the personal desire, to correct it in front of the same size audience. The bunker above what the Allies called Omaha Beach still stands today, one of dozens of surviving German coastal fortifications along the Normandy shoreline, now visited by tourists, retracing the outline of the battle largely through the version of events the film and the book made famous, standing in a quiet field overlooking a beach that draws hundreds of thousands of visitors a year, most of them arriving with some version of Pluskat's story already lodged in their memory from a film or a documentary long before they ever climbed inside the concrete structure itself, reading the same handful of dramatic sentences on a small interpretive plaque that summarize, in a few lines, a claim historians are still not fully able to verify. Somewhere in the more specialized literature on the invasion, in unit records, veteran testimonies, and the patient, unglamorous cross-referencing work of historians who never had a film production attached to their version of events and never needed one. A more accurate, more contested, and considerably less cinematic account of that same morning survives in parallel, read by far fewer people, checked far more carefully against surviving documentation, And on the specific question of who actually saw the invasion fleet first, still not entirely resolved more than 80 years later, a genuine historical uncertainty that a single well-cast actor and a well-written screenplay managed to erase from public memory almost entirely for the better part of 6 decades. If you want more stories about the legends that outran the record and the people who spent the rest of their lives trying to correct them, subscribe, and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.